Starting off with my mic muted is never a good sign. Happy Friday, all ladies, gents, and of course, all of our friends beyond the binary. My name, for those unfamiliar, is Jack Gorsline. I'm an investigative reporter, founder of Psychedelic States of America and the Psychedelic Writers Guild, coming to you live with another edition of the Friday News Roundup, powered by Psychedelics Today. It's a solo show with yours truly today. We'll probably be in and out in less than half an hour, though that usually is around our time frame. Certainly a number of things to cover, and looking forward to bringing some more in-depth coverage in the weeks ahead. But we start with an update out of what here in Washington, D.C., as the FDA this morning granted 3 priority vouchers to a handful of psychedelic biotech companies, specifically Compass Pathways, Otsuka Therapeutics, based in Japan, which recently acquired Transcend Therapeutics, which technically the voucher was granted to Transcend, but they were recently acquired by, as Joe Moore, founder of Psychedelics Today, and I have discussed previously, recently bought by Japanese multinational pharmaceutical giant Otsuka Pharmaceutical. And then, of course, the a lot of speculation was that Resilient Therapeutics, formerly Lykos, formerly MAPS PBC, might be the recipient of one of these priority vouchers, given their strong interest in resubmitting their novel drug application for their MDMA-assisted therapy compound or application. They were not granted said priority voucher this time around, possibly due to the already fast-tracked process that a resubmitted NDA might receive. But that said, clear indication following President Trump's executive order was signed last Saturday, yet another clear indication that fast-tracking some sort of increased access or expedited approval timelines for psychedelic medicine is clearly a hot priority, at least for now, in the West Wing here in D.C. Of course, these priority vouchers come off the heels of the FDA granting an investigative novel drug designation to Demarex's noribogaine, which is now set to undergo phase 2 clinical trial later this summer for alcohol use disorder. Noribogaine, as Joe and I discussed, is what ibogaine synthesizes your body into. So some of the harder cardiovascular, cardiotoxic effects that one might run into with pure or straight ibogaine, if you will, can be a little bit milder with noribogaine. Of course, magnesium, as many who know the ibogaine field and the state of ibogaine, practice and treatment these days, know that magnesium plays a key role in kind of combating or lowering the cardiovascular risk that may be associated with ibogaine use, especially in high doses. All that said, we spent a good amount of time on Wednesday breaking down the executive order. I will not belabor with another detailed analysis. But one thing we touched on that we weren't able to really flesh out, that I am fortunate enough to have been able to provide an update on in my newly syndicated article for Double Blind Magazine that published this morning, is some of the very specific language that was listed in the executive order that some congressional insiders that I have spoken to have at least raised their eyebrows at as a possible nod to presidential administrative support for any number of congressional policy pathways forward. As I've previously reported, there are 4 bills, 3 really, if you consider the Innovative Therapy Centers for Excellence Act being both a House and Senate companion. But right now there have been 4 psychedelics-related bills filed at the congressional level so far this year. And the executive order made nod to the progress that is already being forged on Capitol Hill. So specifically, mentioning of right to try in the executive order has sparked some really unique discussions and interesting discussions behind closed doors here in DC, it seems. I had previously reported that the right to try codification, esque Freedom to Heal Act, which is in some sense a way to codify Schedule 1 access through right to try pathways. Again, for a one-sentence backgrounder, right to try is a general legal theory that President Trump signed into existence in 2018 through an executive order that basically said if an investigative drug or medicine has completed at least a phase 1 clinical trial, then American citizens have a right to try said investigative drug to combat, quote, life-threatening illness. Now, there have been many members of the psychedelic movement and of the psychedelic legal field. Want to give a big shout out to Catherine Tucker and her work in, Cusker versus the Oregon Health Authority, as well as her and Shane Pennington's challenge to the DEA and HHS on the current Schedule 1 status of psilocybin on the basis of depression, and life-threatening illness on the one hand, but also on behalf of patients facing end-of-life care treatment, being able to have access to some of these drugs that are considered Schedule 1 through right to try. So a number of different evolving legal efforts and policy reform-driven efforts have emerged, trying to find a way to codify this idea of right to try Schedule 1 substances, or some of these psychedelic substances that are still listed as Schedule 1 as part of, that right to try framework. The Freedom to Heal Act seems to have at least some renewed interest. It sounds like, based on conversations I've had in recent weeks. And while I did report for Double Blind Magazine and have been pretty vocal about my understanding, based on previous sources I've spoken to, about the Freedom to Heal Act's quote unquote perceived lack of viability, the right to try, language listed in the executive order really has served as something of a rejoinder to reignite conversation and discourse surrounding the possibility of the Freedom to Heal Act as a way to codify right to try into law, in a faster, more expedited timeline than battling out in the courts. So ultimately, as I reported in Double Blind this morning, and we'll be happy to link to in the show notes, and definitely go check out all of my profiles on social media, et cetera, to give it a read. It's linked accordingly across the web. But as I reported for Double Blind this morning, ultimately, the future of the Freedom to Heal Act runs through the Senate Judiciary Committee. The leaked emails that I had reported on previously were from the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee, wherein one of the staffers, and SVAC is what they call it here in DC, did indicate that there was seemingly a lack of support for the Freedom to Heal Act moving forward. But ultimately, the bill's future does not lie with SVAC. Does their opinion as a committee, or as folks with relationships with other committee staffers and other committee members, have some sort of importance? Absolutely. But ultimately, it remains to be seen whether or not the Senate Judiciary Committee will act and schedule a hearing for the Freedom to Heal Act, especially in the wake of, the mentioning of right to try. It very well could happen. I will be the first to report it if you hear more in the not too distant future. But I also do just want to note who the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee is, which is Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. A man who was born, I kid you not, before the invention of sliced bread. I don't think that's necessarily an insult. That's just a historical fact. The man is in his 90s, and I believe running for re-election. So all of that said, where does Senator Chuck Grassley stand on psychedelic policy reform? Well, there was a very notable DEA religious exemption waiver case, I believe, that was eventually tried in some sort of federal court setting. But that Chuck Grassley, who, to preface, made it very clear that he is not in favor of any one psychedelic religious structure or another, nor is he supportive of any one psychedelic religious faith group or another, but did provide testimony and written support, or at least some sort of documentation for an Iowa-based psilocybin church's defense as to why they should be granted a religious exemption waiver by the DEA. So, excuse me. Senator Chuck Grassley's office also very notoriously does not like the press. So I have yet to have any luck tracking down some sort of comment or statement or indication from anybody over at Grassley's office surrounding where they might stand, or where the Senate Judiciary Committee might stand. But again, the mentioning of the right to try framework and Trump's previous support through his 2018 executive order seems, explicitly in the executive order, along with nods to expedited pathways to the Veterans Health Administration, which we'll get to here in a second, as far as congressional policy implications. But it is always worth, as a reporter, being, and worth it to be able to provide amended or newfound information that influences the future, especially when it comes to policy reform. comparative to previous reporting that I may have put out. So very curious on a personal level to see what happens next with the Freedom to Heal Act, as one could argue again, this right to try notion listed in the executive order that Trump signed into law last Saturday could very well be a catalyst for renewed interest on Capitol Hill and across the congressional landscape. Moving on, very excited to be able to share that next week I will be on the ground in Capitol Hill for the aforementioned Senate Veteran Affairs Committee. They have a hearing scheduled for the Veterans Health Administration, VHA, Novel Therapeutics Preparedness Act, which I had previously reported on both for Lucid News and a number of other outlets in recent weeks, introduced jointly by Senators Tim Sheehy of Montana, Republican, as well as Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona, which seeks to establish an Office of Novel Therapeutics in the Veterans Health Administration, the federal level, that would fast track or at least provide rapid access, frameworks through an advisory council and a number of other bureaucratic structures to be created within said proposed office that would hopefully at some point lead to recommendations that could be provided across the vast scope of federal healthcare bureaucracy, right? So this idea of an Office of Novel Therapeutics within the VA, being able to capitalize on the enormous interest and support, especially from the Republican Party, which holds a majority in Congress, and the White House presently, of course, to fast track regulatory frameworks and experiment with different access points through the Veterans Health Administration that could then very well lay the groundwork and frameworks that could be implemented across the entirety of federal healthcare as the monster of bureaucracy, multi-bureaucracy, if you will, that it is, which also worth noting, as the United States healthcare system, or at least our medical innovations, tend to set the standard, as well as our drug laws, for the norm across any number of medical sectors, innovation research around the world. This regulatory framework that we may implement through, if such a VHA, Office of Novel Therapeutics Preparedness Act, is signed into law, that could shape the way that government healthcare administers psychedelic medicine around the world for decades to come. So the importance of this bill is not to be taken lightly. And this is the first psychedelics-related legislative hearing, at the congressional level all term. Despite these 4 bills, Senate roundtable hearing that occurred related to the Freedom to Heal Act, and other psychedelic legislation pathways last December. But this is the first time that any committee has said, we're going to put this to a vote. And we're going to see if we want to move it forward based on the enormous interest or otherwise. And as I mentioned earlier, there was explicit mention in the executive order of being, supportive of, and part of the executive order being signed, the goal of which is to really expedite pathways for federally funded research, federally supported research, and more through the Veterans Health Administration. So expect the VHA Novel Therapeutics Preparedness Act to get a thorough check down, look down, investigative look, etc., from all of the members of the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee in the days to come, and expect to hear more from me after the hearing next week. Man, 14 minutes already. Where does the time go? One of the things I am really excited to continue to highlight in my coverage that I think is worth noting, and then I will bash a little bit of mainstream media coverage here in a second before we move on, is the influence of non-veteran voices on the future of policy reform. I teased in some of the promo that I put out for this live stream a little bit later than I usually do on Fridays. Bear with me. But that I have an exciting interview coming up next week with NFL safety Jordan Poyer for the Buffalo Bills, an avowed ayahuasca user and fan of all things psychedelics, both from a spiritual and healing standpoint, but also I think the immense potential of psychedelics to treat traumatic brain injuries is something that has become an emerging focus point in rhetoric surrounding veteran care and psychedelics. Even beyond PTSD, we're now witnessing, especially with the neuroregenerative properties and potential of substances like ibogaine, even 5-MeO-DMT, NMDMT, straight DMT, if you will, along with even psilocybin, beyond the Parkinson's, beyond early onset dementia, beyond multiple sclerosis. So many athletes which are really our modern day gladiators, a corny analogy, but an accurate one, if you ask me, uh, are suffering with severe traumatic brain injuries that take a toll in ways that you don't even really notice. Having played contact sports for well over a decade myself, I didn't even really notice. I was never a pro, was never anywhere close to anything like that. Don't get me wrong, but in 15 years almost of playing football, must have had a dozen concussions. That psychedelic use in my mid and early 20s really opened my eyes to how much I was missing, as far as how those concussions and even the things like getting your bell rung or seeing stars end up being concussive episodes. So the emergence in advocacy spaces, or even just in general modern psychedelic culture spaces, of active NFL athletes. Obviously, folks in psychedelic spaces are aware of Aaron Rodgers, quarterback for formerly of the Green Bay Packers and most recently for the Pittsburgh Steelers. His avowed support, and interest and frequent use of ayahuasca. But active NFL athletes like Jordan Poyer, especially from POC communities, really help broaden the scope of athletes' awareness and broader American culture's awareness of the multivariant potential of psychedelic medicine, especially as it pertains to far more than just addressing the mental health crisis. So, very eager to interview Jordan, who has a really cool documentary debuting in the next couple of weeks. Stay tuned for more details on that. I'm not sure that we'll make it to a half hour today, though it has been a thrill to host solo. One other update I do want to be able to provide is that we have a number of exciting new offerings rolling out from the Psychedelic Writers Guild. Stay tuned for a big announcement next week as far as public membership rates and how you can continue to support. And yeah, I think that's all I've got for today, folks. But again, my name is Jack Gorsline, founder of Psychedelic States of America, investigative reporter. This has been another edition of the PSA Friday News Roundup, and we'll see you on Monday.